poor widow was lost in the desert, and the prince said, "I'll save you, but only as my wife." The desert sun burns high. A poor widow stumbles across the sand, lips cracked, eyes fading. Then the thunder of hooves, banners snapping in the wind, and a prince laughing before his men. His words cut sharper than steel. "I'll save you, but only as my wife." But what began as mockery soon stirs whispers in the court. Servants bow to her kindness. Villagers call her Princess of the Desert, and locked inside her late husband's satchel, maps that could change the fate of the entire province. Now nobles scheme in the shadows. A jealous lady sharpens lies, and the prince himself must decide. Will he cast her aside to protect his crown or stand beside her, even if it costs him everything? When love and pride collide beneath the burning sun, who will truly be saved? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The merciless sun beat down upon Elena Marlowe as she stumbled along the dusty road, her throat parched and her vision blurring. Her faithful donkey had collapsed 2 miles back, leaving her to carry what little remained of her possessions. The rough leather of her traveling bag cut into her shoulder, but she dared not leave behind her late husband's precious surveying maps. "Please, Lord," she whispered through cracked lips, her voice barely a whisper in the desert wind. "Grant me strength for just a few more steps." The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful sight that Elena was too exhausted to properly admire. Her mind drifted to the events that had led her here. 6 months ago, her beloved Thomas had kissed her goodbye before departing on what should have been a routine surveying expedition. Instead, a messenger had arrived with news of his fatal fall from a cliff face. The creditors had descended like vultures, forcing her to sell their modest cottage to settle Thomas's outstanding debts. With nothing left but his maps and her determination, Elena had set out for Prince Adrian's province. Thomas had often spoken of the work he'd done mapping the region's boundaries. Surely, she thought, those connections might help her secure a position in service at the fortress. Now those hopes seemed to fade like the dying sunlight. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, accompanied by the thunder of hooves. Elena's heart leaped with hope, then sank as she made out the elaborate banners of Prince Adrian's hunting party. The nobles' rich laughter carried across the desert air as they drew closer. "What have we here?" called out a richly dressed nobleman, reining in his horse. "A stray beggar woman, lost in our lands?" Elena straightened her spine despite her exhaustion. "I am Elena Marlowe, widow of Thomas Marlowe, the royal surveyor," she managed to say, her dignity intact even as her legs trembled beneath her dot. The nobles exchanged amused glances, their fine clothes and jeweled sword hilts glinting in the fading light. One young lord tossed a copper coin into the dust before her feet, earning appreciative chuckles from his companions. "Enough." The commanding voice cut through the laughter like a blade. The hunting party parted to reveal Prince Adrian himself, resplendent atop his black stallion. His sharp features wore an expression of calculated amusement as he studied Elena. "Your Highness," Elena curtsied, though the movement nearly cost her what remained of her balance. "The widow Marlowe," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. "How fortunate we are to find you in such desperate circumstances." His eyes glittered with something Elena couldn't quite read. "Shall I play the gallant prince and rescue this damsel in distress?" The nobles tittered, but Adrian raised a hand for silence. "I shall save her," he declared with theatrical flourish, "yet only as my wife." A shocked silence fell over the hunting party. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she processed his words. The prince's reputation for cruel wit was well known, but this was beyond mere mockery. She saw the trap he'd laid, refuse, and die here in the desert, or accept and become the subject of court ridicule. But Elena Marlowe was made of sterner stuff than the prince expected. She gathered what remained of her strength and met his gaze directly. "Then I accept, Your Highness," she replied, her voice clear and steady despite her parched throat. "I shall live and honor the vow." Gasps erupted from the assembled nobles. Prince Adrian's smirk froze on his face as the full impact of his own words, and her acceptance, struck him. He had meant to toy with her, to offer an impossible choice. Instead, she had turned his trap back upon himself, binding him to his own mocking proposal. For a long moment, their eyes remained locked, his filled with dawning realization, hers with quiet determination. The desert wind whipped around them, carrying with it the weight of words that could not be unsaid. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the fortress infirmary's narrow windows, casting long shadows across Elena's bed. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings of stone walls and the sharp smell of medicinal herbs. The events of the previous day felt like a distant fever dream. "Hold still." "Madam," instructed the physician, a stern-faced man with graying temples. He placed another leech on her arm, making Elena wince. "These will restore your humors after such a grave ordeal in the desert heat." Two servant girls stood near the doorway, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. Though they tried to be discreet, their words carried clearly across the quiet chamber. "The prince's widow bride, can you imagine?" One murmured, stealing glances at Elena. "From the desert dust straight to silk sheets." "Hush now," the other warned, though her own eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Though 'tis true his word binds him, even if spoken in jest." Elena closed her eyes, trying to shut out their gossip. Her head still ached from dehydration, and the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had accepted Prince Adrian's mocking proposal, turning his cruel joke into a binding promise before witnesses dot in the fortress's grand study. Princess Isabel confronted her brother. "You cannot dismiss this as mere sport, Adrian," she insisted, her gentle voice firm with conviction. "Your word was given before God in your hunting party." Adrian paced before the fireplace, his riding boots clicking against the stone floor. "It was clearly in jest, dear sister." "Surely no one expects—" "I expect," Isabel interrupted, "that my brother will behave with the honor befitting his station." She smoothed her embroidered skirts, a gesture that always preceded her most determined statements. "The woman would have died had you not intervened. Perhaps Providence guided your words, even if spoken in mockery." Adrian's jaw tightened, but he could not entirely dismiss his sister's counsel. She had always been his moral compass, her piety and kindness a gentle but persistent force. Within hours, the fortress chaplain was summoned. The elderly man's quill scratched across parchment as he drafted the special marriage license, his weathered hands steady with decades of practice. "It shall be properly recorded," he assured Princess Isabel, who supervised the process with quiet determination. Meanwhile, Elena found herself swept into a whirlwind of preparation. The servant girls who had whispered about her that morning now helped her bathe, their hands gentle as they washed the desert dust from her hair. They dressed her in borrowed finery, a gown of pale blue silk that had once belonged to Princess Isabel. "'Tis a bit long," one maid observed, pinning up the hem, "but it shall serve for now." Elena caught her reflection in a polished silver mirror and hardly recognized herself. The silk draped elegantly over her figure, though her face still showed the strain of her desert ordeal. "Thank you," she said softly to the servants, who seemed surprised by her genuine gratitude. The fortress chapel was cool and dim, scented with beeswax candles and ancient stone. Prince Adrian stood at the altar with barely concealed disdain, his posture rigid as Elena approached. He played his part with minimal courtesy, speaking the required words clearly but without warmth. As the first Sunday banns were read, Elena heard the chaplain's voice echo through the chapel. "I publish the banns of marriage between His Highness, Prince Adrian of Valmor, and Mistress Elena Marlowe, widow. If any person knows cause or just impediment why these two persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it." The words seemed to ripple through the fortress like waves in a pond. By nightfall, every corridor and courtyard hummed with the news. Elena had been officially accepted as bride-in-waiting, bound not only by the prince's word, but now by both ecclesiastical and court custom. In the garrison, soldiers and servants alike traded stories about the widow who had risen from desert desperation to royal betrothal in a single day. Some spoke with awe, others with skepticism, but all understood the weight of tradition that now protected her position. What had begun as a prince's arrogant jest had become an unbreakable commitment, witnessed by the church and recorded in the fortress's ancient books. The great hall buzzed with whispers and the clink of silver against fine china as Elena sat stiffly at the long wooden table. Candlelight flickered across faces both curious and contemptuous. Her borrowed dress, though clean and pressed, marked her as an outsider among the silk-clad nobility. Elena studied the array of gleaming utensils before her, each one a puzzle to be solved. With trembling fingers, she grasped what she hoped was the correct spoon for her soup. A titter rose from several young ladies nearby as the implement wavered in her grip. "Dear me," drawled Lady Harriet, her voice carrying deliberately across the table. "Perhaps we should provide our guest with a wooden spoon. More familiar, I'd imagine." Elena's cheeks warmed, but she kept her chin high. "Thank you for your concern, my lady," she replied evenly. "Though I find silver serves just as well once one grows accustomed to its weight." From the corner of her eye, she noticed several servants exchange approving glances. One maid, while pouring wine, gave Elena an encouraging smile. Prince Adrian, seated at the head of the table, appeared more interested in his goblet than the conversation. Yet his grip on the stem had tightened at Lady Harriet's words. The awkward moment was broken by the arrival of a messenger, his boots dusty from the road. He carried a small cloth bundle and a worn leather folio. "Begging your pardon, Your Highness." The widow Marlowe's belongings, retrieved from the inn where she lodged. Elena's heart lifted at the sight of Edward's precious maps. The steward, a shrewd-faced man named Morris, stepped forward to receive the items, but his hands lingered over the folio. His eyes widened slightly as he leafed through the pages. "Most interesting," he murmured, too softly for most to hear. "These markings, they show underground streams, water sources beneath the desert lands." He shot Elena a calculating look before presenting the items to Adrian. The prince barely glanced at the papers. "Add them to the ladies' chamber effects," he commanded with a dismissive wave, but the damage was done. The steward's whispered discovery spread through the hall like wildfire. Elena heard fragments of conversation. Water rights alone would be worth a fortune. The surveyor must have mapped the entire region. Double quotes. Such knowledge in common hands. Double quote leaned close to his companion, his voice carrying just far enough for Elena to catch. "Accidents can be arranged. The desert is vast after all." Elena's soup grew cold as her appetite vanished. She noticed how several nobles now watched her with predatory interest, while others pointedly avoided her gaze. Even the servants' expressions had grown guarded. The one kitchen maid pressed a warm roll into her hand with a whispered, "Keep your strength, miss." Prince Adrian's usual mask of boredom slipped for just a moment as Lord Blackwood's words reached him. His eyes met Elena's across the table, and something flickered in their depths. Concern? Warning? But he quickly returned to his studied indifference. When the interminable meal finally ended, Elena retreated to her assigned chamber. It was a modest room by the fortress's standards, but grander than any she had known before. A single candle burned on the heavy wooden table where her belongings waited. With reverent care, she opened the leather folio. The familiar sight of Edward's precise handwriting brought tears to her eyes. His maps spread across the table like precious artifacts, each careful line representing months of work measuring the land, tracking the hidden sources of life-giving water beneath the barren surface. "Oh, Edward," she whispered, tracing the path of an underground stream with her finger. "You knew the true wealth of this place, didn't you?" Not gold or gems, but water, the desert's real treasure. The candle flame danced, casting moving shadows across the papers. Alina's voice grew stronger as she spoke to the empty room. "Edward, I shall guard what you gave me, even if they seek to take it." 2 mornings after the map's discovery, Prince Adrian strode through the fortress corridors, his boots echoing against stone as servants scurried to prepare for the upcoming frontier tour. He paused at a window, gazing across the sun-baked lands he would soon inspect. Behind him, Princess Isabel's silk skirts rustled as she approached. "Brother," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You cannot leave Elena behind." Adrian turned, his expression darkening. "The frontier settlements are no place for your betrothed." Isabel raised an elegant eyebrow. "What will the people think if you hide her away like something shameful? They must see her as their future princess." Adrian's jaw clenched, but he could not deny his sister's logic. "Very well," he conceded with ill grace. "Have her ready by dawn tomorrow." The journey proved more challenging than Alina expected. Their carriage jolted over rough terrain as the sun beat down mercilessly. Inside, she sat across from Princess Isabel, while Adrian rode ahead with his guards. Each evening, they made camp beneath vast desert skies, the air cooling rapidly as servants erected tents and lit fires. Alina could not remain idle. When she noticed a young stable boy limping, she beckoned him closer. "Let me see your boot," she said kindly. The leather was split along the sole, letting sand and stones torture his feet. Taking needle and thread from her modest sewing kit, she mended it carefully while sharing her water and bread with him. "Thank you, miss," he whispered, eyes wide with gratitude. Other servants gathered to watch, and soon Alina found herself tending to various small hurts and tears. She worked quietly, her needle flashing in the firelight, as stories and laughter flowed around her. The soldiers watching from their posts nodded with growing respect. Here was no pampered noble lady, but someone who understood their daily struggles. Word of her kindness spread through the camp, changing how they saw the prince's unexpected bride. On the 4th day of their journey, they encountered a troubling sight. A merchant caravan lay scattered across the sands, their camels weak from thirst, men and women huddled in whatever shade they could find. Their leader approached Adrian's party with desperate eyes. "Your Highness, we lost our way 3 days past. Our water runs low, and the wells we sought were dry. I fear we shall not survive another day in this heat." Elena had been studying the horizon, comparing it to the memories of Edward's maps she had examined so carefully. She recognized a distinctive rock formation to the east, one her husband had marked. Taking a deep breath, she spoke up. "Your Highness, if I may?" When Adrian nodded curtly, she continued, "There should be an oasis 2 hours' ride to the northeast. The rocks there channel underground springs to the surface." Adrian's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but the merchant's plight left him little choice. "Lead on then," he commanded. "But know that their lives rest in your hands." Elena guided them across the shifting sands, her heart pounding as she searched for the landmarks Edward had so carefully documented. When they crested a final dune, cries of joy erupted. Below them, a grove of date palms surrounded a clear pool of water. The merchants fell to their knees in gratitude, calling her an angel of mercy. Their camels drank deeply while children splashed in the life-giving water. Even the most hardened soldiers smiled at the scene of relief and celebration. That night, as the combined camp settled around multiple fires, Elena sat alone, gazing at the stars. Prince Adrian's approaching footsteps made her turn. "Perhaps," he said slowly, settling nearby but not too close. "You are not the fool I took you for." Elena's lips curved in a slight smile, though wariness remained in her eyes. She had won a small victory, but she knew better than to trust too quickly in noble praise. The stars wheeled overhead in silence as they sat, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's events and what they might mean. The journey back to the Fortress wound through sun-baked hills and rocky passes. On the third morning, Prince Adrian surprised his entourage by commanding that his own horse be brought alongside Elena's modest mare. The widow sat properly in her borrowed side saddle, her back straight, despite the endless hours of travel. "You handle yourself well for a commoner," Adrian remarked, though the usual bite was missing from his words. The morning sun caught the silver threads in his embroidered jacket. Elena's hands tightened on her reins. "God gives strength to all his children, your highness, regardless of their birth." The prince's mount snorted and tossed its head, but Adrian held it steady. "And what of those he burdens with expectations that chain them like prison walls?" "Even prison walls can protect as well as confine," Elena replied softly. She turned to meet his gaze. "Your people need the structure of nobility, just as the desert needs its oases." They rode in silence for a while, hooves crunching on gravel. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice lower. "My father never let me forget what was expected of a prince. Every mistake earned a lecture on duty and dignity. And yet you survived to rule," Elena observed. "While my Edward ... double quotes," she paused, touching the silver cross at her throat. "We worked side by side, surveying the land, sharing bread and dreams. When he died, I learned that dignity comes not from what we possess, but from how we face what God gives us." Adrian watched her profile against the morning sky. "You speak of providence, yet here you are, bound to a prince's jest. Perhaps providence works through jests as well as prayers." She answered with a slight smile. As they approached the fortress 3 days later, crowds lined the dusty roads. "Princess of the desert," they called out, waving and reaching toward Elena. She acknowledged them with gentle nods, while Adrian sat straighter in his saddle. "They seem quite taken with their surveyor's widow," he commented dryly, though Elena caught an unfamiliar note in his voice. Was it pride? "They are kind to remember a stranger's small service," she replied. "Small?" Adrian scoffed. "You saved an entire caravan with your husband's maps. Though I suppose such modesty becomes a princess-to-be." Inside the fortress walls, life resumed its familiar patterns. That evening, Elena made her way to the chapel, where candlelight flickered against stone walls. A young servant boy lay curled on a wooden pew, his face flushed with fever. Elena knelt beside him, laying a cool hand on his forehead. "There now, little one. What troubles you?" "My stomach, miss," the boy whispered. "And cook said I mustn't complain, but ... Hush," Elena soothed, reaching for the herbs she carried in her pocket. "Let us see what can be done." She did not notice Adrian standing in the shadows of the chapel doorway, watching as she mixed mint and chamomile with cool water, helping the child sip slowly. Her fingers moved with gentle certainty, her voice soft with comfort as she hummed an old hymn. The prince remained silent, his expression troubled in the dim light. When Elena finally rose, the boy sleeping more peacefully, Adrian withdrew before she could see him. Later that night, Elena heard footsteps outside her chamber door. She had just finished her evening prayers, and the single candle cast long shadows across the stone floor. A knock came, firm but hesitant. She opened the door to find Adrian standing there, his usual confident posture somehow uncertain. "I ... double quotes," he began, then stopped. Something flickered in his eyes, something that made Elena's heart beat faster. But whatever words lay unspoken between them remained trapped behind duty and doubt. Adrian's shoulders stiffened, and he gave her a formal bow. "Good evening, Widow Marlowe. I trust you are adequately settled." Without waiting for her response, he turned and strode away down the torch-lit corridor. Elena stood in her doorway, one hand pressed against the rough wood, watching until his shadow disappeared around the corner. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she closed the door, confusion written across her features in the candlelight. Candlelight flickered across silver plates and crystal, goblets in the fortress's great dining hall. Nobles in their finest silks and velvets gathered for the formal supper. their jewels glinting like stars against the dark oak panels. Elena sat quietly at her appointed place, dressed in a borrowed gown of pale blue silk that made her look almost ethereal. Countess Mirail swept into the hall fashionably late, her crimson gown rustling as she moved. Her dark eyes fixed on Elena with predatory interest. The Countess had long considered herself destined to be Adrian's bride, and her smile held no warmth as she took her seat. "How charming to see our desert flower attempting to bloom indoors," Mirail called out, her voice carrying across the table. "Tell us, dear Elena, do you find the silver difficult to manage after years of wooden spoons?" Elena lifted her chin, meeting the Countess's gaze steadily. "Your concern touches me, my lady. Though simple, my late husband ensured I learned proper manners. He believed dignity came from character rather than circumstances." Several nobles nodded approvingly at Elena's measured response. Mirail's perfect features tightened with displeasure as she watched her barb fall flat. She turned to whisper behind her fan to her companions, their tittering laughter sharp as needles dot throughout the meal. Mirail launched one subtle attack after another. Yet Elena met each with grace, neither rising to the bait nor lowering herself to retaliate. Her quiet dignity only seemed to feed Mirail's growing anger. Later that evening, Mirail paced in her chambers, her face flushed with fury. "That common widow makes fools of us all," she hissed to her maid. "She must be exposed for what she truly is." The next morning, the fortress buzzed with new gossip. The head steward, his pockets heavy with Mirail's gold, stood before the prince's council. "Your Highness, I must speak of a grave matter," he announced, bowing low. "The widow's maps, I believe them to be clever forgeries. She is no innocent, but a schemer who trapped you with false promises of fortune." The council chamber erupted in concerned murmurs. The eldest counselor raised his voice above the din. "Your Highness, we must act swiftly. This betrothal cannot stand. Think of your family's honor, the scandal that would follow if word spreads that you were deceived by a common fortune hunter." Adrian sat rigid in his chair, his face unreadable as stone. Elena stood to the side, her hands clasped tightly together, watching as the man she had begun to trust remained silent in the face of these accusations. "The marriage bans can still be withdrawn," another counselor urged. "She must be sent away immediately, before more damage is done." Still Adrian said nothing, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Elena felt the weight of his silence like a physical blow. After all they had shared on their desert journey, the quiet conversations, the growing understanding, he would not even speak in her defense. With trembling dignity, Elena curtsied to the council. "By your leave, my lords." Her voice was steady though her heart ached. She turned and walked from the chamber, her steps measured until she was out of sight. As darkness fell over the fortress, Elena made her way to the chapel. The empty stone room was lit only by devotional candles, their flames casting long shadows on the walls. She knelt before the altar, her borrowed skirts pooling around her on the cold floor. Tears fell silently down her cheeks as she clasped her hands in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the sacred silence, "if I must walk alone once more, let me walk in your truth." The candles flickered, as if in answer to her quiet plea, their light touching the tear tracks on her face with gentle radiance. Dawn painted the fortress walls in shades of rose and gold. But for Elena, the sunrise brought only sorrow. The great hall buzzed with whispers as Adrian sat rigid on his throne, his face a mask of stone. The morning council had gathered to pass judgment, and Elena stood alone before them, her heart breaking at Adrian's silence. "The evidence against the widow is clear," declared one elderly counselor, his voice trembling with false regret. "These maps must be forgeries, and her intentions suspect." Elena's fingers tightened around the leather folio containing her husband's life work. She looked to Adrian, searching for any trace of the man who had ridden beside her under desert stars, who had shared his dreams and doubts. But he would not meet her gaze. Two guards approached, their boots echoing against the marble floor. "My lady," one said softly, "you must come with us." Princess Isabel burst through the crowd, her eyes red with tears. "Brother, you cannot do this. You know in your heart, enough." Adrian's voice cracked like thunder, though his hands gripped his throne's arms until his knuckles whitened. "The council has spoken. Let it be done." Isabel rushed to Elena's side, pressing a wrapped bundle into her hands. "Take this, dear friend," she whispered, unclasping her own wool traveling cloak and draping it around Elena's shoulders. "Bread and cheese, and a flask of water. Oh, that I could do more." Elena embraced the princess briefly, touching her cheek in gratitude. The guards waited patiently, showing more mercy than their masters. As she gathered her dignity around her like armor at the fortress gates, Elena paused. The desert stretched before her, a sea of sand and stone painted golden in the morning light. The same desert that had nearly claimed her life now beckoned her home. She clutched her husband's maps closer, remembering Edward's voice as clearly as if he stood beside her. "These aren't just papers, my love," he had said. "They're hope for the people. Water veins that could turn barren earth to gardens, if only they knew where to dig." Elena lifted her chin and stepped forward. "Then I shall tell them," she whispered to his memory. "Every village, every camp. Your work will not be buried in noble coffers." As Elena's figure grew smaller against the horizon, Adrian paced his private chambers like a caged lion. A servant had brought him his father's private papers records he had never been meant to see until his coronation. There, in the late king's own hand, lay the truth that turned his world to ashes. "The surveyor's maps must remain our secret," the decree read. "Let the common folk depend upon our wells and cisterns. Their thirst keeps them obedient, their need keeps them loyal. This I command for the good of the realm." Adrian hurled the papers aside, bile rising in his throat. Mireille's accusations, the council's convenient testimony, all orchestrated to protect their corrupt power over the people's most basic needs. He had let them use him as their puppet, too blind with pride to see the strings. Night fell over the fortress, stars appearing one by one in the velvet sky. Adrian moved through the shadows of the stable yard, his dark cloak concealing him from the guards. His finest horse stood saddled and ready, provisions strapped to the saddle. He gazed up at the same stars that had watched him fall in love with Elena on their desert journey. The same stars that now guided her somewhere in the vast wilderness. Adrian touched the hilt of his sword, feeling the weight of his signet ring beneath his glove. "Forgive me, Elena," he whispered to the starlit heavens. "I shall find you if it costs my crown." Moonlight caught the tears on his cheeks as he mounted, turning his horse toward the eastern gate. Behind him lay privilege, power, and everything he had been raised to cherish. Before him stretched the unknown, with only love and honor as his compass. Elena stumbled through the shifting sands, her cracked lips burning with each breath. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but she pressed forward, guided by the landmarks carefully noted in Edward's maps. Her once fine borrowed dress was now tattered and dusty, yet she clutched the precious leather folio of maps to her chest, like a shield in the shimmering distance. She spotted movement, people gathering around what appeared to be a small cluster of palm trees. As she drew closer, the sound of voices carried on the hot wind, accompanied by the rhythmic thud of shovels striking earth. An oasis lay before her, where village men labored to dig wells in the unforgiving ground. "Please," Elena called out, her voice hoarse from thirst. "I have something that may help you." The villagers paused in their work, regarding her with curious eyes. A weathered elder approached, offering her a ladle of precious water. Elena drank gratefully before spreading Edward's maps across a smooth stone. "These marks here," she explained, pointing to her husband's careful notations, "show where the underground streams flow strongest. Your well would yield more water if dug just 20 paces to the east." The elder studied the maps with growing wonder. "These are master survey maps," he breathed. How came you by them? My husband drew them before he died. He meant them for the people, not to be locked away for noble profit. Elena's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Take them. Use them. The water belongs to all who thirst. A murmur of excitement rippled through the gathered villagers. But as Elena tried to stand, the world tilted sideways. Days of walking in the heat, with little food and less rest, finally overwhelmed her. The last thing she saw was the desert sky spinning above her as darkness claimed her vision. She woke to the sound of horses, hooves, and men's voices. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Surely that couldn't be Prince Adrian's voice calling her name with such desperate concern. But when she opened her eyes, there he was, dismounting his horse with none of his usual grace. His fine clothes were covered in dust, his face lined with exhaustion. Behind him, a complement of royal guards sat astride their mounts, banners hanging limp in the still air. Elena tried to sit up from where the villagers had laid her in the shade. Your Highness, she began formally, but Adrian was already crossing the space between them. To her astonishment, and the gasps of those gathered, the Prince of Valmer fell to his knees in the sand before her. Gone was his mask of pride, replaced by raw emotion she had never seen him display. Elena, he said, his voice rough with feeling, I have been a fool. A proud, blind fool who nearly lost everything that matters because I couldn't see past my own arrogance. She stared at him, scarcely believing her ears. The proud prince who had once mocked her was now kneeling in the dirt, his head bowed in genuine humility. I found my father's decree, Adrian continued, ordering your husband's maps hidden to protect noble interests. I saw Mirael's treachery, her bribes to slander you. But worse than any of that was my own cowardice in failing to defend you. Elena's heart thundered in her chest as Adrian raised his eyes to meet hers. I rode day and night to find you, he said. Not to seize you or the maps, but to beg your forgiveness. To ask you to save me from my own foolishness by being mine, this time in truth, not jest. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I swear I shall spend my life proving worthy of your love. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the desert dust. You hurt me deeply, she whispered. I know, Adrian answered, his voice breaking. I shall regret it until my dying day. Elena reached out, touching his face gently. But a heart that can admit its faults and seek to make amends, that is a heart worth forgiving. Adrian gathered her into his arms then, holding her as if she were more precious than all his kingdom's gold. Around them, the villagers watched in reverent silence as prince and widow embraced beneath the swaying palm fronds, their love as real and life-giving as the water flowing beneath the desert sands. The desert wind stirred Elena's hair as she rode beside Prince Adrian, their horses' hooves striking the steady rhythm against the sun-baked earth. This time, she sat tall in her own saddle rather than being carried as a rescued beggar. The fortress loomed ahead, its stone walls catching the golden light of afternoon. Are you ready? Adrian asked softly, his eyes holding concern as he watched her. Elena straightened her spine, though her heart fluttered. Yes, your highness. Truth must have its day. The fortress gates opened wide, and whispers rippled through the gathered crowd as they entered side by side. Servants paused in their tasks, nobles clustered on the steps, and Elena caught sight of Countess Mirael's face twisted with barely concealed fury in the great hall. Adrian called his council to order. Torchlight flickered across stern faces as nobles took their seats at the long table. Elena stood quietly beside Princess Isabel, who squeezed her hand in support. My lords and ladies, Adrian's voice rang clear and strong. We gather to right a grave wrong. He produced a leather document case bearing his father's seal. This decree, hidden these many years, ordered the suppression of vital water maps to benefit noble estates alone. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Adrian's eyes found Mirael, who had gone pale. Furthermore, we have proof that Countess Mirael orchestrated false testimony against the Lady Elena. seeking to destroy her good name through treachery. The Countess rose, her silk skirts rustling. "Your Highness, I protest." "Silence." Adrian's command cracked like a whip. He held up the sealed decree, then with deliberate motion, tore it to shreds. The pieces fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves. No longer shall water be hoarded by the privileged few. From this day forward, all settlers in our lands shall have equal access to wells and springs. Nobles shifted uncomfortably, but none dared speak against him. Adrian turned to Elena, extending his hand. She stepped forward with quiet dignity to stand beside him. The Lady Elena Marlowe showed more nobility in her acts of mercy than many born to title. She chose to share her husband's maps with those in need, risking all to help others. For this, she shall be honored as heroine of our desert lands. Through the fortress windows came the sound of church bells, their joyful pealing announcing the final reading of the banns. Elena's heart soared at the sound, even as she noted the sour expressions among the noble families. But from the courtyard rose answering cheers, the voices of servants, traders, and common folk who had gathered to witness this day. Their joy drowned out any grumbling from the nobility. "Guards," Adrian commanded, "escort the former Countess Mirail from the fortress. Her title is stripped, her lands forfeit to the crown." Mirail's face contorted with rage as guards moved to flank her. "You cannot do this. I am of noble blood." "Noble blood means nothing without noble deeds," Adrian replied coldly. "You sought to destroy an innocent woman for your own gain. Go, and be grateful your punishment is not harsher." Elena watched in silence as Mirail was led away, her elaborate gown sweeping the floor, her head held high even in disgrace. Despite everything, Elena felt a flutter of pity for her. To be so consumed by ambition and pride that love became impossible, that was punishment enough. Adrian's warm hand clasped hers, drawing her attention back to him. His touch conveyed quiet strength, steady support, and Elena felt peace settle over her heart. They had weathered the storm together, truth had prevailed, and love had proven stronger than ancient prejudices. Through the great windows, sunlight streamed in bright ribbons across the floor, and the bells continued their joyful song. In their ringing, Elena heard not just the announcement of a wedding, but the herald of a new day for all their people, noble and common alike. The fortress chapel blazed with 100 beeswax candles on this momentous morning. Their warm glow caught the rich velvet of noble garments in the upper gallery and sparkled off the simple brass buttons of common folk who filled the space below. Sweet incense rose in delicate spirals from silver censers, and morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, blessing all assembled with its golden touch. Elena stood before the chapel doors, her heart beating like a dove's wings beneath the cream-colored silk of her borrowed wedding gown. Princess Isabel had woven white desert roses through her dark hair, and her cheeks were flushed with joy and nervousness. "Ready, my dear?" Isabel whispered, adjusting Elena's veil with sisterly care. The chapel doors opened wide, and Elena stepped forward. The gathered crowd rose as one, nobles and common folk alike. But Elena saw only Adrian waiting at the altar, tall and proud in his formal attire, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. As she walked down the aisle, Elena caught glimpses of familiar faces, the fortress servants who had shown her kindness, the village folk who had welcomed her maps, even some of the merchants she had guided to water. They smiled and nodded, these people who had become her own. Adrian extended his hand as she reached him, and Elena placed her fingers in his. His grip was warm and sure, anchoring her as they turned to face the chaplain. This time there was no mockery in his touch, no jest in his stance, only the solemn weight of true devotion. "Dearly beloved," the chaplain began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed chapel. The familiar words of the marriage service washed over them, but it was their own vows that brought tears to many eyes. "I take thee, Elena," Adrian's voice rang clear and strong, "not as my jest but as my heart's own choice. Before God and these witnesses, I pledge my truth and my crown's protection. Alana's voice trembled but held firm. I take thee, Adrian, not from necessity but from love freely given. Before God and these witnesses, I pledge my truth and my life's devotion. As Adrian slipped the golden ring onto her finger, he proclaimed in a voice all could hear, I name thee Princess of the Desert, for thy heart holds more nobility than any title could bestow. The words rippled through the assembly, and Elena heard them whispered again and again, Princess of the Desert. Princess of the Desert. After the ceremony, the great hall buzzed with unprecedented activity. Long tables stretched the full length of the space, but this time without the usual strict divisions of rank. Noble silk brushed against homespun wool as all took their places together, an unheard-of mixing that caused more than a few raised eyebrows among the old guard. Servants brought forth platters of simple but hearty fare, fresh bread, roasted meats, fruits from the oasis gardens. Wine flowed freely, and gradually the stiffness began to ease as conversation and laughter filled the air. Adrian rose to his feet, lifting his goblet high. The hall fell silent, waiting. My friends, he began, his voice carrying to every corner, today we celebrate not just a marriage, but a new understanding. For I have learned that the truest nobility is found in character, not birth. His eyes found Elena's, warm with pride and love. My wife has taught me this, and together we shall build upon this truth. As evening drew its purple veil across the sky, Adrian led Elena to the fortress balcony. Below, in the courtyard, villagers gathered with torches, their voices rising in song. The melody was simple but heartfelt, a desert tune Elena recognized from her travels, now transformed into a blessing for their union. The torchlight flickered across Adrian's face as he turned to her. You saved me twice, he whispered, drawing her close. First in jest, then in truth. Elena's heart swelled with love as she gazed up at him. And together we shall save this land, she replied softly, her words a promise and a prayer. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the desert moon rose vast and luminous above the fortress walls, its silver light crowning their love with celestial blessing, while the songs of their people rose sweet and true into the night. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.